They sure have been busy in Tehran, haven't they? Judging purely by the major news headlines, first it was the Houthis, by all intelligence reports a proxy of Iran, trying to shut down passage through the Red Sea. Then it was another proxy based in Iraq who snuck a drone past US defenses in Jordan, leading to 3 deaths. And now the world sits impatiently, waiting for the next shoe to drop. The trigger for all this? Fingers are pointing to Gaza, where Israel is at war with Hamas, yet another proxy of Iran's. And indeed, the Gaza offensive is playing an important role here. With anger in the Arab world seeing a recent spike, groups like the Houthis have all sorts of incentives to commit attacks, and advertise their commitment to the cause, to recruit more volunteers, and solicit more donations. And even though Iran is not an Arab country, some instability in the region is in Tehran's interest. However, in some ways, this is the wrong war to look at. The deeper story lies further to the north and is 2 years old. Through a complicated tale of military economics, the origin of Iran's new push instead resides on the front lines in Ukraine and back in Moscow. Rewind to February 2023. It was then that Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation against Ukraine. Reaction in the West ranged from disappointment to anger. Almost immediately, the initial sanctions against Russia snapped into place. But that mattered little to Moscow, at least at first. Had the war gone according to plan, Zelensky would have surrendered in a few weeks, and all of the materiel that Russia could just pull directly off of the shelf would have been enough to declare a victory. Instead, with the right combination of resolve and tactics, Ukraine repelled Russia from Kyiv, and eventually stabilized the front lines out east. The shelves of existing materiel were no longer enough. It was time for Russia to spool up the production lines. However, the Kremlin seemed unprepared to handle how modern supply chain logistics interacted with a major sanctions regime. Yes, Russia manufactured an incredible amount of arms domestically, so much so that it was commonly the world's number 2 exporter, to only the United States. But many of the input products for those weapons were imported from Western countries, and all it took was a snap of the fingers for the West to turn off the spigots. Remember, though, that Iran is ultimately the protagonist of today's story. Flashback to the mid-1990s. This was the era of the Clinton administration, which faced the dual problem of Iranian support for what would later be called the Axis of Resistance, and Iran's nascent nuclear program, which Tehran claimed to be a science endeavor, but intelligence communities suspected was a front for military applications. Thus began the 1996 set of sanctions that would set the tone for decades. Of course, sanctions targeting Iran were nothing new. They have existed at some level since the Iran hostage crisis, which began less than a year after the Iranian Revolution deposed the US-backed Shah. Even so, Bill's bill raised things to a new level of strength. What would follow over the years to come was the standard two-pronged approach that we have discussed in the past. First, limit imports so that Iran would have a more difficult time constructing any weapons. And second, limit exports so Iran would have less money to pay for such weapons programs. As the Clinton administration gave way to the George W. Bush administration, U.S. foreign policy took a more adventurous turn in the region, capped with an invasion of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Iran's major regional rival. Within the United States, the invasion was largely sold as a way to ensure that Saddam would never be able to develop weapons of mass destruction. It also served as a not-so-subtle warning to Iran, even if those weapons of mass destruction programs in Iraq were nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, in Tehran, there seemed to be movement about developing a new strategy. Bush, though, faced a fork in the road between diplomacy and continued coercion. Given the resounding success in Iraq, he chose to play hardball. Though that success would be short-lived, the sanction strategy continued through the duration of his term. Ironically, 2 decades later, Iran's solution to the first problem of access to imports would soften the blow of the second problem with money. Faced with import restrictions, Iran pursued what is known as import substitution to resolve the problem. That is just a fancy way of saying learning how to produce things for yourself that you previously had to rely on others for. Iran, alternatively, prefers the term economy of resistance, which more or less has been Iran's philosophy since then. Outside of a brief respite following the Obama administration's negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal as it is more commonly known, those sanctions have held steady for almost 2 decades. The agreement offered up sanctions relief and promises of warmer relations. In exchange, Iran would have to freeze its nuclear research. But the strong sanctions returned during the Trump administration. Now, with almost 3 decades of experience, Iran has learned to master weapons production without the aid of basic access to Western markets. To be clear, producing those weapons is more expensive than it would otherwise be, precisely because Iran lacks access to the standard supply chains. It is not as though the US policy has completely failed. But it did lead to an unintended consequence. The important thing for today is that an insulated production line was now out there in the world. Back to Russia. The imposition of economic sanctions meant that Moscow, too, would have to start working out that basic import substitution process. But that takes time. After all, Iran did not master this overnight. Fortress Russia was not prepared for this contingency, and there were urgent priorities to get materiel on the ground in Ukraine. As a stopgap measure, the Kremlin began looking elsewhere for weapons. What procurement officials found was a general lack of interest, though. A country like China, for example, would seem like the perfect partner. It is friendly, describes its relationship with Russia as limitless, and has recently grown into a notable arms exporter. The catch was that Beijing worried that open assistance would draw the wrath of the sanctions regime. What Russia needed instead was a country with little to lose, and that was not vulnerable to those Western economic sanctions. And thus, a new partnership with Iran was born. How much exactly the partnership is worth to Iran is unclear. It turns out that neither country is excited to reveal secret budgetary information. But when you have reports of a single plane carrying 140 million euros, Iran helping to develop a drone factory inside of Russia, and hundreds of thousands of artillery shells going into the country, that is going to raise some questions about what is not being seen. Then there are non-economic forms of compensation, like increased protection at the UN Security Council, thanks to Russia's veto power there, though the limits there are apparently not absolute. Thus, with a newly found injection of cash and increased political cover, it appears that Iran is going on a spending spree, helping finance various components of its axis of resistance. The situation in Gaza has brought more media attention to the region overall, but Iran has been involved in exchanges that date back well before October. In March 2023, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reported that Iran had attacked US troops 83 times over his tenure at that point. And true to form, that month featured a particularly tense spat involving competing interventions in Syria. A March 23rd drone attack killed 1 US contractor, caused 4 traumatic brain injuries, and left 5 other soldiers and 1 other contractor injured. Then, on March 24th, a 10-rocket strike caused 2 traumatic brain injuries and injured 4 civilians, while a separate rocket strike left 1 soldier injured, while yet another separate attack, this time with a drone, managed to miss the mark. US intelligence warned of more attacks to come, and that proved accurate. In other words, the high-profile Houthi attacks near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are a more recent symptom of a broader long-term problem. And perhaps because of that, The United States had already prepared for instability along the strait, having dispatched Combined Task Force 153 to cover the Red Sea in April 2022. Actually, the specific concern of Iran and drones stretches back to Biden's predecessor. Meanwhile, the extra cash also helps explain why Iran felt more assertive in a different proxy battle with Pakistan, which has no substantive connection to Israel. Moreover, we are seeing North Korea in a similar position of resurgence, although this again receives less attention in the news because it is not connected to Gaza. The parallels between it and Iran are striking. North Korea has also lived for decades under far-reaching Western sanctions. Pyongyang, too, has been forced to figure out the import substitution process. And all of that experience meant that Russia found a second place to purchase weapons from following the invasion. And with that, a toast to North Korea being able to throw its weight around just a little bit more on the peninsula. So, yes, the Israel-Hamas war has opened up a new chapter in the broader proxy conflict with Iran. But the first war-related domino to fall was actually in Moscow, a year and a half earlier. If you like dominoes and learning about the strategy behind wars, well, first check out my books on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, then set up a bunch of them in a line and see what happens. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.